So, new section titled A Private Ceremony. On the day of her long drive from Bellingham to Seattle, Justine had chosen to wear a shin-length gray woolen dress, a pair of brown leather boots which went up to her calves, long-sleeve white blouse, and a sweater vest. She also wove her long gray hair into single braid which dangled halfway down her back. For warmth against the cold, outdoor winter weather, she wore her ankle-length burgundy-colored wool overcoat, along with a beret of a similar hue. So, she found the Pacific Rim Apartments without too much trouble. Bernie and Sheila greeted her with an enthused warmth. They had a 5:30 appointment at the King County Courthouse. The short ceremony would take place in the empty courtroom in which Judge Matthew R. Jacobson presided. He turned out to be a gentleman in his mid-50s, wiry graying dark hair combed back from his brow, and he wore a pair of black-framed bifocals. Also, he had donned his robe just before he stepped out from his chambers to meet the happy couple. Justine stood nearby Judge Jacobson as Judge Jacobson conducted a simple abbreviated ceremony, after which they all signed the legal document which made the marriage official and binding. Then Justine asked the judge if he wouldn't mind posing for a few snapshots along with Bernie and Sheila. He said, of course, that would be fine, but I really must go in a few minutes. I've got a dinner engagement with my wife tonight. Justine took several quick shots with her cell phone. From the courthouse, the three of them walked to a restaurant Bernie had been at a few times when squiring film company representatives around town. During the meal, their conversation was lively and ongoing. Justine showed Sheila and Bernie the few pictures she had taken after they'd selected their respective dinners, while a convivial waiter had noted down their choices. When the waiter first appeared beside the table and handed them 3 menus, Justine asked the fellow if he could bring them a bottle of champagne. This was a very special occasion, since her 2 friends had just gotten married, quite literally only a few minutes ago. The waiter said of course, and he named off 4 different brands. The only name Justine recognized was Cold Duck, and that became her choice. The waiter returned immediately with a champagne bottle immersed in an ice bucket. He opened the bottle with a short, resounding pop, filled their glasses, and then returned the bottle to its ice bucket, where it remained on the table, and he quickly departed. Justine raised her glass and said, "Here's to you both, and your lasting happiness." Their glasses met, all 3 of them, nearly simultaneously. Then she said, "Yes, this is quite a special occasion." Sheila, still holding her glass in midair, said, "Sometimes I thought that Bernie and I must have known each other during a previous lifetime." Hearing this, Bernie thought, oh fuck, I hope she doesn't start talking about all that supernatural bullshit she's into. Justine hasn't much patience for any of that crap. He glanced from Sheila to Justine and said, "One thing you should know about my new wife, she's developed what I'd say is a fairly knowledgeable interest in the supernatural." "Sheila, I've always thought," Justine said with a calm detachment, "that dividing this world of people into rationalists and irrationalists is one of the worst of the false dichotomies, and there are so many of those, since it is so easy for people to fall into an entrenched pattern of thinking, often in the them or us mode these days, given the crazy politics we have right now in this country. She paused and then said, and I should point out that Charles Peirce, the founder of American pragmatism, did not dismiss outright the existence of so-called paranormal phenomena, such as extrasensory perception, as with most rationalists. So, Sheila said, what did Peirce think about that sort of thing? Well, basically what he said was that the jury was still out on the whole business. He stood by the proposition that a phenomena's existence or actuality is not dependent upon its observability by human beings. I don't know about that. Clearly, there are many things in the world of which we can never know, at least not with any near certainty, which only means that most human experience, to one extent or another, is interwoven with ambiguity. I'll drink to that, Bernie said. Mr. and Mrs. Connolly, Erica's parents, stepped into their daughter's new unfamiliar home, which was Theo's house. Whereas Mr. Connolly viewed his daughter's new domestic arrangement from a practical point of view in terms of monthly cash savings, Mrs. Connolly felt dubious about Erica's altered circumstances living with the father of her ex-husband. To her, it smacked of the incestuous, and she was not at all pleased that Theo had not only proposed this arrangement in the first place, but had managed to actually talk her into it. Erica kept insisting this move of hers had been motivated by the significant drop in her cost of living, but even more importantly, there would be an adult male presence in their home once again, and her children would have a father figure whom they could look up to. What was wrong with that? When Erica had first told her mother during one of their countless phone calls what she proposed to do in the near future, that she and the children would move into her ex-father-in-law's house, Mrs. Connolly was scandalized. Theo is still my children's grandfather, Mother. Must I really have to point that out to you? Both Erica and Theo stood in the living room, waiting to greet them as they stepped inside from the vestibule. Rather stiffly, Mrs. Connolly said, "Hello, Theo." "Hello, Lorraine. How are you today?" "I'm quite well, thank you." "Hey there, Frank, man. I haven't seen you in a coon's age." "How are you doing, Theo?" The men shook hands. "I'm doing fine, buddy. Erica and the kids are all settled in. We're all doing just great. One big happy family now, you bet," Theo said. A look of unconcealed distaste passed over Mrs. Connolly's face. "Well, dinner's just about ready," Erica said, "so why don't we all go into the dining room?" Soon all four adults and the two children were seated, and a brief prayer of thankfulness was offered up by Mrs. Connolly. "We thank thee, Lord, for the fine meal Erica has fixed, and we thank thee for all the blessings thou hast given us over the years. Amen." "Thank God you kept it brief this time, Mother," Erica was thinking as she lifted up a basket of dinner rolls from the table and then handed it to her father. "Here you are, Dad. You've always liked my dinner rolls." "I certainly have, sweetheart, and you know that we always enjoy having dinner with you and the kids. Your mother and I wouldn't have missed this for the world, not for the world." "Now it seems that Theo will be with us on these occasions," said Mrs. Connolly pointedly. "Surely she won't dare launch into an attack against my living with Theo now," Erica thought with a twinge of anxiety. God, I hope not. Once he had arrived in New York City, for the following day the first of his two appearances would take place, Jack called Estella, and with almost jittery elation explained to her that he would be experiencing what he would be experiencing in the next 2 days. Both late-night talk shows had arranged that his second interview with Seth Meyers would be taped before a live audience the very next day, so that the two broadcasting networks could minimize on their shared cost of his accommodations. as well as their equal contributions to his plane fare. "That is so cool, Jack," Estella enthused. "Now I remember you telling me about this the last time you called. You must be really excited." "Apprehensive is more like it." "Oh, you'll do great, Jack. Those people will love your jokes. You know you are good at writing jokes, especially when you tell those crazy, improbable stories of yours. I bet you've been rehearsing a lot, huh?" "Yeah, plenty." "Just don't wear out your voice, Jack. You should not smoke so much." At 10 o'clock the following morning, a car sent from the CBS broadcasting headquarters paused in front of the hotel entrance. Jack got in the back, and the driver whisked them back into the city's heavy, relentless traffic. 10 minutes and 15 blocks later, Jack walked into the lobby of CBS and made his inquiry at the receptionist's desk and was instructed to take the elevator to the 17th floor, where the receptionist there would direct him to Mr. Colbert's office. As soon as he stepped out of the elevator, Jack now faced another receptionist, a fashion-conscious woman wearing a pair of designer glasses. Jack stepped up to the counter behind which she sat at a desk. At the moment she was speaking on the phone. He waited with withering patience for what had to have been at least 5 minutes. Finally she hung up the phone and with a replica of a smile said, "How can I help you, sir?" "I'm Jack Bayfield, miss, one of Stephen Colbert's guests on his show later tonight. I was told to come to his office first thing today so he can get a sense of my style, I suppose, and that we'd sketch out what we might talk about." "Of course. Just a moment, please." She pressed an intercom button on her phone console and said, "Jack Bayfield is here to see you." Jack could hear his immediate response. "Good, send him in. I've been expecting him." Jack opened the door to the man's office and stepped into a large room with posh furniture, and along the wood-paneled walls were numerous photos and souvenirs from his travels. Colbert sprang out of his chair and stepped out from behind his desk to greet yet another first-time guest. Bearing in mind that Bayfield was a stand-up comic of some caliber, yet still comparatively unknown, he extended a hand saying, "Good to meet you, Jack. Just call me Steve. So, I expect you have your monologue prepared. May I see it for a moment?" "Sure," Jack said, and from his suitcoat pocket fished out the folded 3 sheets of paper upon which he'd written down what he planned to say and handed them to Colbert. Colbert took the sheets and unfolded them and scanned over Jack's material. "Oh, would you like anything to drink? Coffee, bottled water?" "No, I'm good, thanks." "Okay, well, I see you're going to exploit the huge gap between the politics in your state of Washington and neighboring Idaho. It sounds promising. Let me hear a run-through, would you?" "Sure." Jack launched into his routine, though he moderated his physical gestures. With his hand at his chin, the other clasping his elbow, Colbert listened without interruption. Smiling, he laughed briefly a few times. That very same night, nearly 2,900 miles away from New York and Seattle, Sheila was watching Stephen Colbert late night show while Bernie was already asleep. He rarely went to bed any later than 10 o'clock during the week, when he had to get to work the next morning. Yesterday, Jack had sent her a brief text message telling her that he would actually be on that show the following night, and now she was listening to Colbert doing his nightly opening monologue. Nearly 10 minutes later, he mentioned his guest lineup for the evening. Among a new emerging hip-hop artist, an actor, and an animal trainer was Jack, who would be the first to appear. And now, direct from the West Coast and Roscoe's Comedy Club in Seattle, please welcome Jack Bayfield. To sustain the note of applause, Jack strode onto the stage, a short man with long steps. You could say he strutted out from behind the curtain onto the stage. Unlike many comedians who stand in one spot to tell their jokes as though they were standing behind an invisible rostrum, Jack moved about frequently within a 5-foot radius as he enacted his absurd and amusing stories. Sheila had been to several of Jack's performances at Roscoe's Comedy Club, so she noticed right away that he was doing something a bit different now, something much more involved. He told 2 comic narratives, the first with 2 characters at odds with one another, and the second absurd account had featured 3 characters, 5 different voices altogether. Now, having just concluded his act, Jack bathed in the outpouring of boisterous applause, accompanied by a few brief appreciative shouts and whistles. He made a conservative bow, rose, kissed the fingers of his right hand, and extended a languorous wave to the audience. Then he walked over to where Colbert was standing. The men greeted one another with a handshake, and then Jack sat down in the first armchair, as did Colbert behind his desk. Bernie, only a few minutes away from leaving for work, finally began to hear Sheila stir about in the bedroom. A moment later, she opened the bedroom door and stepped still half asleep into the bathroom, leaving the door ajar. Once she had peed, she called out, "Bernie, you haven't left for work already, have you?" "I'll be out the door in about 5 minutes. What's up?" "Well, come here for a minute, would you? There's something I want to tell you." A moment later, Bernie stepped up to the bathroom door, nudged it open another inch, and said, "Okay, what did you want to tell me?" With her voice growing more excited, she said, "Jack was on Stephen Colbert's show last night, Bernie, and he was really good, just hilarious, although he seemed more manic to me than usual." "Well, what do you expect? It was his big debut on national television. And he was in New York City, after all. Who wouldn't feel jazzed up in a place like that?" "Well, not very many. Look, I've got to leave. There's a scheduled phone call on my docket this morning, so... But that's great news about Jack. Did he make any jokes about having gotten shot?" "Yes, and he made it even funnier with his exaggerated facial expressions." "Bye now. Gotta run. Bring home a surprise for dinner. I don't want to cook tonight. Your wish, etc. Love you even when you're on the toilet. Bye." Once she finished in the bathroom, Sheila went into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot Bernie had brewed earlier. He always makes it too strong, she thought. 4 cups of this and my stomach will be tied up in knots. I still can't get over how good Jack was last night. Maybe his 5-year struggle to make it in show business has finally paid off somehow. But I'm happy for him. He certainly worked hard enough to get this far. And in the same text, he said he'd be on the Seth Meyers show tonight. I should call him later on when it's about 2 or 3 o'clock in New York. What is it, a 3 or 4 hour difference? I can never remember. Not much later, she was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Val called her. Valerie Porter was her best friend and confidant in Seattle. They've known each other for well over 10 years, from the time they first met when they both worked in the typing pool at Boeing's corporate offices. Both were quick, sharp-witted women who complemented one another. Their conversations flowed easily with great winding breadth into infrequently steeped in pop culture references. The names of widely known actors, rock and R&B and jazz musicians, composers and famous scientists, and all the usual politicians sprinkled into their talk. They also happen to share a very low opinion of the more typical conversations among men who were preoccupied with either sports or politics or business matters or unattached women. Most men are sheer lame brains, Val would sometimes opine. And they have this self-defeating notion that they won't ever understand us. They just don't want emotions to complicate things, Sheila said. "Oh, never," Val said. "Or at least not until they get angry and flabbergasted and nearly tongue-tied." On this particular morning, Val started the conversation by saying She just happened to watch Stephen Colbert last night, and when he mentioned the name of his first guest, I couldn't believe it. That couldn't be Sheila's old roving friend, I thought. And soon he walks onto the stage, and sure enough, it was the Jack we know. Does he still come around to see you? No, he never drops by anymore, not since Bernie and I began dating back in November. I'm not sure where he's spending his downtime these days, but he's not spending it here. He hasn't called me since Bernie and I first started to go out. I'm going to call him later today and congratulate him. I thought he was hilarious, Sheila. He's gotten better and a lot funnier than he used to be. Remember you took me to Roscoe's once to see his routine? Oh yes, I remember. One of those nights when I got absolutely trashed. During the flight back to Spokane, Jack was undergoing a monotonous layover at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. Some severe late winter weather had swept the country and was disrupting the flight schedules of all the national airlines, Delta in particular, it seemed. Jack's original scheduled layover had been a mere hour and 15 minutes. Presently, he was approaching the tail end of his third interminable hour. He was sitting at one of the bars scattered throughout the terminal, about a 5-minute walk to gate D23, which was where the prop jet he eventually would be in was parked. One of Delta's armada of regional aircraft, which would take him and 29 other passengers from Chicago to Spokane. About 10 minutes earlier, a slender woman in her mid-20s had taken a seat next to Jack, their adjacent elbows about a foot apart. All this time, she'd been engaged in a conversation on her cell phone. She had an Eastern European accent, although from where he could not make out, of course. When she finally paused in her conversation to ask the bartender for another drink, Stolichnaya on the rocks, Jack turned toward her and said, now having caught her eye, "You must have had a fashion model photo session here in Chicago for Vogue or Vanity Fair. A girl with your sort of looks flying on to New York, are you?" Her green eyes widened with surprise and she said, "What? How do you know this? Have you been following me?" "No, of course not. I've been in New York for the last 3 days. And now I'm on my way home to Spokane. Though stalled out here in Chicago, just like you, miss. My name is Katerina, by the way. And yes, I work as a fashion model, but of course I am much more than that. Hardly like the vacuous, grim-faced Melania. I'm Jack. It's good to finally meet a fellow stranded passenger. I find airports such a bore. They're so tedious, from the security inspection on down the line. But my profession involves a lot of travel, so what can I do apart from to sit here and have a chat with you? Now tell me, Jack, what do you do to earn your daily bread?" "I entertain for a living, Katerina. I'm a stand-up comic. In fact, I just had my first appearance on the Stephen Colbert show." "No, I don't believe you. Most single men are liars." "Oh, it's true, all right. Just look at his most recent Wednesday night show on YouTube." "All right, I will," she said, and proceeded to tap a succession of icons displayed on her cell phone, and soon had YouTube on the screen. "I'm his first guest," Jack affirmed, "and he introduces me right after his monologue. Perhaps," she said, "you are not such a liar after all." A few days later, while Erica was eating lunch in the teacher's lounge, one of her colleagues, who was holding a plastic container filled with the stew she had cooked for dinner the previous night, microwaved only a moment ago, joined Erica at the table. Jennifer McFadden taught algebra and geometry. "I saw your ex-husband on TV the other night, Erica," she said, dipping a spoon into her serving of stew. "What?" Erica exclaimed, taken aback. "What on earth are you talking about, Jen?" "That's right, you heard me correctly. I saw Jack on the Stephen Colbert show a few nights ago." "My God, Jack was on TV. Yes, Erica, that's what I've just been telling you. I'll be damned, he finally made it. That's what he always dreamed of doing, you know. At the close of the school day, Erica gathered up a stack of papers turned in by her senior English class after she'd issued a pop quiz on a story they were supposed to have read, one of the Canadian Alice Munro's North Country gems. She stuffed them into her satchel, put on her coat, and walked out of the building to the faculty parking lot and got into her car and drove home to Theo's house. And as she guided her car through a series of Spokane streets, Erica's thoughts once again were continually forming around the renewed question of Jack's future in show business. Jack is like Sherwood Anderson, she thought, who threw his family away by simply walking out on them in favor of writing short stories and courting literary fame for all it was worth, I suppose. Gauguin did the same thing, cast his family aside, and sailed with his easel and oils to Tahiti, where he could paint native Polynesian girls. Some men are never happy at home, and some of the more selfish ones will pack their bags and leave for good. This happens over and over again every day. But even before Jack finally left me and our children for good, long before that, he had poisoned our marriage with that radio announcer woman in Burns, Vicky Lamar, that was her name, the brashy, whorish cunt. Jack must have thought then that he'd grabbed onto quite a prize, the lecherous prick. And whenever we'd been quarreling over his disloyalty to me, he always sought this weird defense, or I don't know, commiseration. Oh, you wouldn't believe what a hollow, empty-souled bitch she turned out to be, on top of being crazy, he might say. Jack's problem was that he liked sex far too much for his own good. My therapist would say to me that I had to realize that Jack was a sex addict, as obsessed with having sex as a heroin junkie is obsessed with getting his next fix. Recently, Sheila had begun testing herself for pregnancy, once every Monday morning when she first got out of bed. Near the end of her piss, she'd nudge the thermometer-shaped test strip beneath her dwindling stream of urine, remove it, and wait a moment or two for the result. And after a month of living with Bernie, she got the result she'd been waiting for with mounting anticipation. But she now realized there would be some ambiguity concerning her future child's paternity. Bernie and I have only been together for just over a month, she thought. And 2 weeks prior to sleeping with Bernie, Jack and I made love once or twice a day while he stayed here at my apartment. More than likely the child will be Bernie's, not Jack's, but the possibility still remains nonetheless. This matter or question of the child's paternity would automatically become an issue, she thought. But then Bernie knows this. He knows that Jack stayed with me on a regular basis every time he was in town, that he stayed here for his downtime, as he called it. I'll have to know. I got to know who the baby's father will be. Fuck, I can't just ignore it. And I'm sure after the baby is born that Jack won't simply disregard it. He'll know it could be his, and I know him well enough to know that he would want to know who the father is. But she'd been taking birth control pills for years, it seemed, practically forever. Yet she quit during doing so right after Bernie moved into her apartment, and they had that solemn little chat on the matter of becoming parents. Marriage plans have been conceived many times over, inspired by the unexpected and unsought-for news of pregnancy. Bernie, she thought, will not have a clue as to what daily life will be like for me in the latter phase of my pregnancy, past the 6-month mark when a woman's belly has grown considerably larger. I know I'm not going to